Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Yulia Skripal, one of the victims of the Salisbury poisoning, has issued her first public statement a month after the attack on her and her father. She said she's been conscious for over a week and that her strength is growing every day. She thanked medical staff and the people of Salisbury for their help and described the whole episode as being somewhat disorientating. The attack with a nerve agent on Yulia and Sergei Skripal sparked an international diplomatic crisis, and the war of words between Russia and the West intensified again today. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
It's just over 4 weeks since Sergei and Yulia Skripal were found poisoned by a nerve agent on this bench in Salisbury. 4 weeks during which the former Russian intelligence officer and his 33-year-old daughter have lain critically ill, at times in a coma. But today, Ms. Skripal revealed that she, at least, was on the mend. In a statement issued on her behalf by the police, she said, "I woke up over a week ago now and am glad to say my strength is growing daily. I'm grateful for the interest in me and for the many messages of goodwill that I've received. I have many people to thank for my recovery and would especially like to mention the people of Salisbury that came to my aid when my father and I were incapacitated." She thanked the staff of Salisbury District Hospital for their care and added, "I'm sure you appreciate that the entire episode is somewhat disorientating, and I hope that you'll respect my privacy and that of my family during the period of my convalescence." Earlier, Russian television broadcast an unverified recording of an alleged phone call between Yulia Skripal and her cousin Victoria, in which Ms. Skripal reportedly claimed that everyone's health was okay with no irreversible harm and that she'd be discharged soon. In London, the Russian ambassador used a news conference once again to deny his country's involvement in the attack on Ms. Skripal and welcomed the news she was recovering.
I'm really happy, and I hope that the Sergei Skripal will also recover. And I'm quite sure that one day Yulia will come back to Moscow.
Today, the Foreign Office said Ms. Skripal had been told about the Russian embassy's offer of consular assistance, but had yet to take up the offer. That didn't stop the ambassador again protesting at his lack of access.
Today, Scotland Yard and the British government is refusing to communicate with us. No answer. The telephones are switched off. So that's the problem for us.
1 month on from the attack on the Skripals, the Russian defiance continues. At an extraordinary news conference here at the Russian embassy for almost 2 hours, the Russian ambassador denied that Russia was involved in the Salisbury attack, denied that it had even ever made Novichok nerve agent, and denied that Russia was internationally isolated. And tonight, Russia will step up that defiance at the United Nations, calling a meeting of the Security Council to challenge the accusations laid at its door. James Landale, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our correspondent Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. But first to Leila Nathu in Salisbury. And Leila, Yulia Skripal's first public statement today. She's clearly making progress.
Yes, Rita, it's quite a turnaround for her. You'll remember that both Yulia and Sergei Skripal were described as being in a critical condition when they were exposed to that deadly nerve agent here in Salisbury just over a month ago. Now, 2 weeks ago, we learned further details about their condition from a court of protection judgment when a judge was giving permission to chemical weapons inspectors to take further blood samples from them. At that time, they were described as being heavily sedated, with Sergei Skripal unable to communicate in any way, Yulia at that point unable to communicate in any meaningful way, and medical tests showing there could be long-term implications for their mental capacity. Now, just a week later, last week, we reported that Yulia had in fact regained consciousness and was talking. The hospital said she had been improving rapidly and was no longer in a critical condition, and clearly her statement today shows just that. Now, Sergei Skripal is himself still in a critical but stable condition. What we don't yet know is why Yulia has recovered to this extent and he has not, whether it's because she has responded better so far to treatment, or in fact whether she was exposed to a lesser extent to that nerve agent.
And Steve, meanwhile, the narrative about this whole affair in Russia is very different to that here.
Yes, if you look at what Russian officials are saying about this story and what the Russian state-controlled media is saying about this story, you begin to see that the picture painted here of the Salisbury poisoning is very different from the one seen in the UK. Russia paints itself as the victim, falsely accused of attempted murder. And what's more, the Russians believe that they have the British authorities on the back foot. They point to political infighting in the UK over the source of the nerve agent. And they say, look at Yulia Skripal, she is recovering. Proof, say the Russians, that there was no military-grade Russian nerve agent. And add to that the gaggle of conspiracy theories the Russians have been coming up with in recent days to try to explain who may have attacked the Skripals and why. And you can see why Moscow might believe that it has proved its innocence.
Steve, thank you. Steve Rosenberg there in Moscow, and thank you to Leila Nathu in Salisbury.
But now let's deal with the other news of the day. The war of words between Britain and Russia has continued to escalate since the Salisbury spy poisonings last month. But the people we hadn't heard from were the Russian victims. Until now, that is. Alex Thompson is outside Arsenal's North London Stadium. Alex, why are you there, and what's been going on?
I am, John. I'll tell you why in a second, but another 24 hours of extraordinary swirl of spin and counter-spin between Moscow and the West. As we speak, the UN Security Council goes into special session in New York to discuss the Skripal affair. And yes, the Emirates Stadium. In a short while, CSK Moscow will meet Arsenal in the quarterfinals of the Europa Cup. Now, here's the thing. The last time these two clubs met at this stadium was the very day that one Alexander Litvinenko met his death through polonium poisoning. And the man British police want as the prime suspect in that murder, none other than Andrew Lugovoy, came to the stadium that night, indeed left traces of polonium in the stadium. And he, of all people, has entered, believe it or not, the fray of this incredible story in the last 24 hours. And indeed, we've heard, it seems, possibly, from Yulia Skripal in hospital in Salisbury. It is, as ever in this story, the reality way stranger than any fiction you could dream up.
A tale of two cities, Salisbury, and a very British-sounding statement from Yulia Skripal released by the police. She thanks passers-by for helping her and her father after their attack. And she describes it all as somewhat disorientating, classic British understatement, and asks people to respect their privacy. What Yulia Skripal really said, or what the Metropolitan Police want her to say. And in Moscow, a different story. Yulia Skripal has been on Russia 1, a phone call apparently from her hospital bed recorded by her cousin Victoria. No signs of British understatement here.
It's all good. Everyone's alive and getting better.
Is Dad okay?
He's fine, resting and sleeping now. Everyone's health is okay. There's nothing irreparable. I'll be out soon. All is okay.
Russia 1 can't confirm it definitely is Yulia Skripal, and nor can we, though the sudden release of the British police statement does indicate that the phone call is authentic. But hold on, what's all this? A tale now of two sofas on Russia 1 last night. Sofa 1, we have Victoria, Yulia Skripal's cousin, and sharing the upholstery, none other than Russian MP and prime suspect in the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London by radioactive polonium, Andrei Lugovoy. And on the other sofa, looking just as comfy, we have Dmitry Kopton, the other prime suspect for British police in the Litvinenko murder. Salisbury and Moscow, two versions of reality. In London today, Russia's denial continues, a press conference convened by Moscow's man.
We never produced Novichok. We don't have any chemicals left in Russia. So basically, this is just the fact of life.
Across the Atlantic, as the UN Security Council goes into special session over this crisis, the British ambassador giving her spin on her way in.
I fear that the Russian motive in calling for a Security Council meeting today is another step in the pattern of obfuscation and contempt for international institutions.
From a pedestrian walkway in Salisbury to the UN Security Council via 300 or so displaced diplomats, situation Skripal spinning, literally, out of any one government's control.
Alex Thompson.
Ever since the poisoning of the Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, there has been a slightly surreal air about the whole awful business. And today we got two versions of reality attributed to Yulia Skripal of how she is and what she's been through. In her first public statement issued by the Metropolitan Police, she said she was recovering day by day. But in a recording of what was said to be a phone call with a cousin released in Russia, someone identifying themselves as Yulia says her father is fine and resting. And that sense of the surreal continued at the UN tonight, with Russia's ambassador linking Salisbury to the TV crime drama Midsummer Murders. But there was a real sense of menace too. The ambassador also accused Britain of faking information, warning the UK, you are playing with fire and you will be sorry.
Мы требуем консульского доступа к Юлии Скрипаль.
Russia may deny the Salisbury poisoning, but tonight its diplomatic sabotage was clear, calling this special meeting of the UN in New York, and extraordinary it certainly was, as Moscow tried to discredit Britain's evidence and authority.
Your appointment of us as a criminal, without facts, without evidence, without a trial or investigation, are null and void. We have told our British colleagues that you're playing with fire and you'll be sorry. It's some sort of theater of the absurd.
We all know why that investigation is underway. It's because the military-grade nerve agent was used in an attempt to kill civilians on British soil. It was a weapon of mass destruction. I think the metaphor that I find most apt is that of an arsonist turned firefighter, but in this particular instance, the arsonist wishes to investigate his own fire.
Away from the conflicting accounts of what happened to Sergei Skripal and his daughter, so far the only version we haven't heard is theirs. But a month on from collapsing here, today Yulia Skripal was finally well enough for a few words. In a statement she said, "I woke up over a week ago now and am glad to say my strength is growing daily. I have many people to thank for my recovery and would especially like to mention the people of Salisbury that came to my aid when my father and I were incapacitated. I am sure you appreciate that the entire episode is somewhat disorientating and I hope that you'll respect my privacy." Hours earlier, her cousin appeared on Russian TV, claiming to have spoken to her on the phone. We can't verify the conversation, but Yulia seems to say her father is all right, adding, "Everyone is recovering, everyone survived, no irreparable harm was done, I'll be discharged soon."
We don't buy it.
Yulia's official statement came just as the Russian ambassador to Britain was making his own, insisting yet again that Moscow doesn't make Novichok and even demanding photos to prove the victims are in hospital.
Doesn't Yulia Skripal's statement add legitimacy to Britain's account of what happened? Do you welcome the fact that her strength is growing daily?
I wrote a letter to the surgeon detective, and I'm really happy. And I hope that the Sergei Skripal will also recover. And I'm quite sure that one day Yulia will come back to Moscow.
The Foreign Office says so far she's turned down the offer of help from Russia. Tonight, Yulia and her father may be recovering, but diplomatic relations are certainly not.
And Paul is with me in the studio to really go through what we saw at the UN tonight, and it was extraordinary language flying around.
Yeah, an absolutely incredible showdown between Britain and Russia. Moscow referencing everything from the Midsummer Murders to Tony Blair to several mentions of the Foreign Secretary, because they're trying to pry open this window of doubt that emerged this week because of this confusion that was thrown up by the Foreign Secretary's comments about whether Porton Down could establish a concrete link to Russia, then the Foreign Office deleting that tweet. What Moscow wants is to introduce enough confusion, enough doubt to undermine Britain's position, and of course it still wants this joint investigation via the OPCW, the chemical weapons watchdog, into what happened in Salisbury. Britain says that is absolutely not going to happen, and tonight the Foreign Secretary hit back at Russia, saying today's gambit by Moscow is to rope the UN Security Council into their own disinformation campaign. The world will see through this shameless cynicism.
And we saw, of course, that extraordinary coalition building up behind the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago. And what we've seen tonight is evidence that is standing firm. And the Russians have been looking very closely to see if there was any sign of any chink in that wall.
Yeah, and they've been trying to really play up any difference between us and our allies, really, at that press conference that I attended this afternoon with the Russian ambassador to Britain. He was talking about the vote at the OPCW yesterday, trying to spin it that actually lots of people had abstained, lots of countries had abstained, and therefore maybe there was this doubt emerging. Actually, I think it's fairer to say that they were voted down. They only got 6 votes yesterday, Russia out 41. Therefore, I don't think they're really yet, at the moment, sort of introducing any cracks into Britain's alliance here. And of course, you've got 28 countries that have taken diplomatic action against Russia. So I think for the moment, our intelligence seems to sort of stack up with our allies, even if it doesn't necessarily stack up for some people in Britain and in Moscow.
OK, Paul, thank you very much indeed for that.
32 days after Yulia Skripal and her father Sergei were poisoned, today she communicated with the outside world. UK police issued a statement on her behalf in which she says that she woke up over a week ago and that her strength is growing daily. She said she had many people to thank for her recovery, including the people of Salisbury who came to the Skripal's aid. She also asked for privacy, saying that the entire episode has been disorientating. The statement came, perhaps not coincidentally, very shortly after Russian TV aired a recording of a telephone conversation purportedly involving Yulia, a call they said they were unable to confirm the authenticity of, and the person she appeared to be speaking to was her cousin Victoria in Russia. In the call, the person said to be Yulia said, when asked about her father, that everyone's health is fine. However, the British authorities have said that they would only issue a new bulletin on Sergei Skripal's health if anything changed, and the last one said he was critical but stable. So what's going on? I'm joined by Gabriel Gatehouse. Gabriel, first of all, let's talk about that phone call. What do you make of it?
Well, Victoria sent this recording round to various journalists this morning, and this was the moment where Russian state TV interrupted its broadcast to air the tape.
Слышать по голосу, что это ты, я понять не могу.
Now, we're not going to broadcast the full tape for a couple of reasons. One, we can't verify that the woman on the other end really is Yulia Skripal, even though her cousin seems to believe that she is. Secondly, we don't know whether Yulia Skripal, if indeed it is her, was aware that the recording was being made. So to protect her privacy, we're just going to highlight a few quotes from this conversation. First, you hear 2 women greet each other, and Victoria, the cousin, seems surprised to hear from Yulia. She says she's relieved that she's feeling better. And then she says, Victoria, that is, she says, look, if I get a visa tomorrow, I'll fly over on Monday. And Yulia, or the person reported to be Yulia, says, Vika, they're not going to give you a visa. Victoria then says, well, if they do give me one, I need you to tell me whether I can visit you. Tell me that I can. And Yulia says, I think not. What with the situation now? We'll sort it out later. Now, listening to the recording itself, it's quite interesting to hear her tone of voice. Yulia Skripal is terse, she's tense, she's brief with her cousin. She doesn't seem to want her to come and visit. A bit later, Victoria asks about the health of Sergei Skripal. Here's what she says. She says, is everything okay with your father? Yulia says, everything's okay. He's resting now. He's asleep. His health is fine. Nothing is irreparable. I'll be discharged soon. Everything's okay. Now, this potentially is the most tantalizing part of this, because it appears to contradict the hospital's assessment of Sergei Skripal's health, which, as you said, Kirsty...
And that was on the 29th of March.
Right, that's right. So that appears to be a contradiction.
So you managed to get through to Victoria just a little time before we came on air, and tell me about that.
The cousin, yes. I got through to her on the phone in Russia, and I asked her how the phone call came about.
Звонит телефон ваш английский. Я говорю, алло, алло.
И звук голоса, вы уверены, что это действительно была Юля?
Да, это Юля, это Юля. Я даже не сомневаюсь в этом, что это Юля.
100%?
100%.
Какова была ваша реакция?
Ну, реакцию вы там сами все слышали. То есть я вот, я как знаете, не верю своим ушам, да. Потом потом как это внешне спокойно, а внутри такое, как сказать, вы знаете, как влюбленность, когда чувство влюбленности, вот такое вот.
А из ее голоса, какова было ваше впечатление от ее здоровья, психологическое, физическое?
Вот психологически, не знаю, ничего не могу сказать, но говорила она обычным, своей обычной тональности.
Мне интересно, как это так получилось, что вы все-таки это записали?
Вот, ну, я как-то я рассказывала уже все. Я работаю, ну, моя работа связана с финансами. И есть некоторые товарищи, которые хотят потом что-то предъявить. И чтобы вот товарищи не предъявляли, у меня стоит эта программа для записи всех моих телефонных разговоров.
Почему вы все-таки решили передать этот запись СМИ?
Ну, потому что, чтобы было видно, что вот, ну, что не только, ну, что Британия, как бы, вот она идет на контакт, она показывает эту запись, дает не в целях того, что сказать, что вот там это, а то, что вот все, процесс идет, все, что Юля пришла в себя, то есть вот с этих целей.
Просто многие говорят о том, что идет информационная война. У вас нет ощущения, что вас используют в такой информационной войне?
Вы думаете, я не переживаю? Я очень переживаю. Я очень переживаю. Мне страшно, ужасно страшно. То, что вот пишут, я не могу всем заткнуть рот. Не могу.
Виктория,
вот они сегодня, понимаете, вот
Виктория, подождите секундочку. Можно спросить, чувствуете ли вы какое-то давление с каких-то сторон, чтобы что-то сказать или там что-то не сказать?
Вы знаете, может, как такового давления нет, но наводящие вопросы, они есть. Вот.
В смысле?
Ну, то есть спрашивают именно так и в таком контексте, чтобы я ответила так, как надо, а не так, как я хочу. Это я ощущаю, да.
So what do you make of it?
Well, Kirsty, it's interesting to hear Victoria, the cousin, say that she feels like she's in the middle of an information war. She talks about leading questions. I hope that wasn't a reference to mine. But the big question really is it authentic? Is it really Yulia Skripal? Now, we don't know, although clearly Victoria thinks it is. Interesting that the police put out their statement from Ms. Skripal just a few hours after this tape was aired. Now, it didn't deny that the tape was not genuine. It didn't make any mention of the tape at all. Whatever its authenticity, I think the fact that it was aired quickly on Russian TV suggests that this could be part of a wider information campaign. I mean, Victoria Skripal was doing the rounds of the Russian TV channels. Yesterday, before the phone call came out, she told one channel that she wanted to come to the UK and bring Yulia Skripal back to Russia. Now, interestingly, today, the Foreign Office said that it had communicated Russia's offer of consular assistance to Yulia Skripal and that she had declined that so far. So it's not clear whether she wants to go back to Russia. It is clear, I think, that Yulia Skripal is now becoming not only a political and diplomatic football, but also potentially that the Russians see her as sort of a living piece of evidence, because Russia was trying to push the OPCW into a joint investigation into the Skripal poisoning, which Britain declined, the OPCW declined. But if Moscow could get Yulia Skripal back to Russia, they could potentially carry out some kind of scientific analysis that could allow them at least to claim that they had some insights of their own into what poisoned her and where the poison came from.
Gabriel, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now is Mark Lyle-Grant, National Security Advisor until last year, the most senior role of its kind in the UK Civil Service, and a former UK Ambassador to the UN. Good evening.
Good evening, Kirsty.
First of all, let's just talk about the interview that has just been conducted by Gabriel Gatehouse. What do you make of it, especially when Victoria claims that she is worried about being used?
Well, I would make 2 points, Kirsty. I mean, the first is we don't know about the veracity of the supposed phone call between Yulia and her cousin Victoria. We know from the past that Russia is certainly not above fabricating evidence. We saw that very clearly at the time of the shooting down of the Malaysian airline, when they produced some satellite imagery that was shown on Russian TV, which experts later demonstrated was faked. So they're not above that. On the other hand, I'm not saying that this phone call was necessarily faked, but if it was genuine, it clearly is part of an information war. Otherwise, why were the Russians listening into it? Why did they publish it so very quickly?
Well, by Gabriel's account, she had taken the tape to various journalists, but I want to look at the timing here. because it looks as if this tape airs on Russian state television. There hasn't been anything from Salisbury for a week, but we know that she's been much better in the last week. And then suddenly, after you've had that airing of that tape, the UK police release an account from Yulia Skripal of her own condition and her thanks for the Salisbury people. It sounds like that is completely in response to the earlier tape.
Well, I think probably it was in response to the earlier tape, although, as you say, information had already come out a few days earlier that she was out of danger, she was recovering, and she was able to communicate. But I think if we look at the bigger picture, Kirsty, actually none of what has happened today fundamentally changes the facts. I think we could put together this phone call being released by the Russians, the UN Security Council meeting that took place tonight, the OPCW, the Organisation of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons meeting yesterday, which was also called by the Russians, is a very clear signal to me that the Russians are actually rather rattled by the strength of the international community's response. They have been a little bit surprised, I think, that not only the United Kingdom, but also 28 other countries have come together, stood by the UK's story, and expelled more than 150 Russian diplomats worldwide. The Russians would not have expected that.
But well, that's interesting, because they go to the UN and there's a lot of sound and fury, and there's talk about why haven't they tested the guinea pigs at the Skripal and all this business. And what is that actually meant to do? This creation of even more sound, even more questions. You know, their behaviour at the UN was kind of classic, kind of strange behaviour. What was it meant to achieve?
It was meant to muddy the waters, to distort and distract, to put out alternative possibilities, to put the United Kingdom on the defensive, to suggest that there are holes in the testimony, the evidence that the United Kingdom is putting out there. Again, this is a very classic Russian pattern. When put under pressure, when put into the corner, they lash out and try and muddy the waters. So they would have hoped to get some of the other members of the Security Council saying, oh, well, look, we don't really know quite what the truth is. Maybe the United Kingdom should talk to the Russians and cooperate.
Is Putin dangerous, more dangerous now?
He's been dangerous for some time. I think this assassination attempt, I mean, horrendous though it is part of a pattern of Russian activity over the last few years. You know, we have seen Russia undermining some of its neighbours.
You've got no doubt that it is Russia.
Absolutely no doubt at all. They've done cyber attacks, many of which we know now have been traced back to entities associated with the Russian state. You've got these assassination attempts. Litvinenko, don't forget, happened only 11 years ago, and a rather similar assassination which was successful against a dissident. We've seen the information warfare. Every day more's coming out about Russia trying to sow divisions, undermine respect for democracy, credibility in elections, both in the United States and in Europe. So there's a wide pattern of activity that I think can be explained by Putin's desperate attempts to make Russia great again, if you coin a phrase. And he can only do that by weakening, in his own mind, by weakening his enemies. Weakening the United States, weakening NATO, the European Union, the UK. That's how he thinks he can make Russia great again.
Thank you very much indeed.
And we're joined tonight by Ian Dunt and Katie Balls to take a look through Friday's newspapers. And we're going to kick off with The Times. And it has a story about where this Novichok came from, which is the key question, really.
Potentially. I mean, this looks to me, and I don't know, but it looks to me like a limited controlled leak, really, because obviously this stems from the uncertainty around Boris Johnson's statements in recent days. It seems like he rather overstepped himself when he said people at Porton Down had assured him that they're absolutely sure that this stuff came from Russia. That wasn't, of course, the way it operated. The way it operated was the people that test for the chemicals will say to you, this is our data on the chemical and the drug itself. There is other intelligence data that goes to the government. They put this stuff together and they will come up with their judgment as to where it is. Now, this is coming out saying not just that they can say it's coming from Russia, but also that there's a specific site in Russia that will be producing this kind of substance to such a small degree that it will be more likely to be used for targeted killings than it ever would in any kind of broader battlefield usage. You have to take it as you get it. It obviously comes from an anonymous source. Like I say, my suspicion is that this might be some kind of controlled leak in order to get an upper hand in the story.
And Katie, after the CEO of Porton Down said that they couldn't confirm where the nerve agent had come from, we were told by the government again that it wasn't just about the the chemistry. It wasn't just about Porton Down, it was also about the intelligence, it was also about who was capable of it, and it was also about Russia's past history. This, we are told by The Times, is part of the intelligence briefing that has been given to the UK's allies.
Yeah, so I think it's safe to say this is a helpful story to the government.
Timely.
Wherever it came from. Because when we did have that interview on Monday, which was authorised by the number 10, the Porton Down scientist, they played it very clumsily because it really helped Russia, because it gave this statement saying, oh, we can't say it was Russia, even though that wasn't the job. I think, and the problem there was the government seemed to be willing to give one quarter, basically, and a picture of how they came to the decision. And if you only give one quarter, so saying it's Novichok, but you can't say where it's from, it does mean that you want the rest of the intelligent picture, the information that all the European leaders and others were given when they decided to back Britain and its findings. And this is one part of that picture. So I think it goes some way, but I do think what is quite remarkable this week is when Theresa May went off on her, walking holiday, she really seemed to be at a high in her premiership, the way she had handled the Salisbury incident, diplomatic triumph in bringing countries with her. And then you fast forward a week, and this week there's been lots of questions about blunders from the Foreign Secretary and also just basic comms failings. And I think this is damage control. I think they are getting back on the right path. I don't think the facts have really changed in the case. But what I think is unfortunate is how a sloppy comms operation has really undone some good work.
This is taking place now in a way that it hasn't before, which is really amid a sort of information war that is almost entirely digital and is about people constantly raising conspiracy theories, constantly tugging around the edges of a story to create doubt. They do it domestically, and of course Russia always does it in an almost sort of weaponised manner, both through the embassy and through the government and even through the UN, as we saw today. Their response to that is it makes it much more difficult. You cannot have ministers out there using imprecise language because it creates an opening for this kind of eventuality. So security services at the moment are pushing for Downing Street to release a bit more of the intelligence that they have in order to try and counter some of that information warfare from Russia. Now, Downing Street's view on this is that it's been more open than usual, especially with allies, and that was the way that Theresa May managed to amass that rather remarkable sort of coalition that she'd done over the last few weeks. But nevertheless, Downing Street just shifting around, finding its feet in what is fundamentally a new kind of information landscape.
We also had this explanation in the UN from the UK's ambassador to the UN tonight about this use of the language highly likely, because, as she said to Russia, the only place that culpability can be decided is in a court of law, and that is why they use those terms, highly likely. Let's have a look at the Mail, which is also continuing with its coverage of the Salisbury poisoning, and this remarkable recovery by Yulia Skripal, who has issued a statement.
Yeah, this is the really good news in all this, which is that Yulia, who's the daughter of the former double agent, she is making a very good recovery. She said that she is getting stronger by the day. She has apparently declined the offer of Russian consulate, and a phone call appears to have been broadcast by Russian media of her speaking to her cousin, but that hasn't been confirmed if it's her. And I think that's all very good news. I think it will also help in establishing more facts around this case, and actually should probably stop some of the conspiracy theorists if she can give information that helps. But then also, touching on this, is obviously this on the same page as the bottom pure denial by Russia, that they had nothing to do with this. So that continues.
Russia's comical ally, they're calling the Kremlin's most senior diplomat in London, who had a news conference today at which he was asked about Yulia Skripal's recovery and welcomed that. We also had the Russian ambassador to the UN talking and mocking the UK's response and saying it's more absurd than Midsummer Murders. I mean, we've had Poirot, we've had Sherlock Holmes, now we've got Midsummer Murders being
I didn't know that they got the Midsummer Murders in Russia, but apparently they must be fans enough for him to bother to use it as a cultural reference. So what's intriguing about the kind of Russian response is always the sort of the sarcasm.
It's bad taste.
And, well, yeah, basically the consistent bad taste, the purposeful bad taste of it. And that's sort of exactly the jokiness of the whole thing, as if it doesn't really matter, the mockery, which oddly does remind you of an internet troll, of the way that people will talk on social media. It is almost as if that kind of manner of doing politics has been internalised to the entire sort of outward posture of the country. You see that very much by what he was putting out today. When he says that the country has never produced Novichok, I mean, no one believes that. That is not to say that they didn't produce this batch of it. This is something that was produced, this is basically part of a Russian generation of nerve agent. It is a quite absurd thing to say. And I think its absurdity has some kind of value. It is to say that basically truth has absolutely no meaning whatsoever in this context. And they will simply say whatever they like in this sort of context, just in order to sort of get rid of any kind of objective anchor that you might root yourself in when you try to assess these things.
I think when you do look at these TV references, problems, it's just like Google what a nerve agent does and the symptoms, and it just isn't at all funny. And I think people who like favouriting or retweeting that should really do that before kind of joining in this kind of Russian kind of take on it, because it's just offensive.